We were contacted by a viewer of the show named Steven Qubrossi. Now, Steven is the owner of a video game studio called Restalgia in Ontario, Canada, but he also likes to make little side projects on the side for fun. Now, what I'm about to show you today isn't available publicly. You can't really go out and buy these from someone. But Steve did make one for us just because he thought it'd be really cool. This is the PiStation, a miniature PlayStation that actually does play PlayStation games. But the difference is, it's about the size of a deck of cards. The system itself is a 3D printed model, which means that it's not actually mold injected plastic, so you'll see some kind of lines and stuff from the 3D printing process. But inside isn't a customized process or anything like that, it's just a Raspberry Pi, version 3 in fact. And inside that Raspberry Pi is enough horsepower to run a whole bunch of games, not just PlayStation, but a bunch of other games. So here's what the system can run right now. To get everything to work, this system is running RetroPie, which is a collection of open source software that allows you to emulate a whole bunch of systems. While setting up RetroPie, Steven selected a group of consoles that could be emulated pretty easily from your couch. He didn't really want to choose video games that would run off DOS emulation or something, because then you'd need a mouse and a keyboard. Every console he chose you can comfortably play with an Xbox One controller, or other controllers that work like the PlayStation 4 controller. The only time I ever found that I needed to use a keyboard was when I was changing some Wi-Fi settings or things like that. This entire setup is done specifically to emulate retro video game systems, but the PiStation is loaded with a lot of other features. Now, like I said, at the core of this system, there's a Raspberry Pi version 3 in here. So it's got Wi-Fi built in, Bluetooth, you have the ability to plug in a whole bunch of controllers and stuff to the USB ports here, and there's 4 of them. You also have a LAN port, which is really nice if you want to use wired internet instead of wireless, and it's got HDMI out and AV out, and it all is powered by a very small micro USB port. That's kind of awesome. The thing is so small but so powerful that you're going to be able to do a lot of other things. And because essentially the core of this is just a Raspberry Pi, well, you can make a whole bunch of things happen if you have the programming knowledge to do so. Steven even made a customized cover for the system because it's 3D printed and you can really make anything you want. And he gave us a little Rerez top so that if we really wanted to, we could put the whole Rerez logo on there, which is pretty cool. Now, as far as game emulation goes, you're going to be able to run a lot of stuff on here, but just keep in mind, not everything is going to emulate properly, and in some cases, some emulators just don't work at all. But let's start off with the most basic of video game emulation, the Atari 2600. Now, of course, there shouldn't be any shock and surprise, this system can run Atari games. Unfortunately, a couple of them just seem to be a little bit off and they didn't seem to load properly. And though that may be an issue with the ROMs that I had, I do imagine that there are some issues on the software side that are actually kind of conflicting with this. But when the games did run, they ran perfect. They looked great, they felt great, and they feel very much like an original 2600 experience. So if that's what you're looking for, you're gonna get that with this. Only with a far different controller. Now, next up is Game Gear. Now, I'm very happy with the Game Gear performance because, believe it or not, playing on an original Game Gear is kind of one of those things that didn't age very well. You see, the screen had a lot of ghosting, and although it was very bright and very colorful, sometimes it was just very hard to see what you were looking at. But with this emulation, the games are coming in so clean and crisp that it's like I'd never seen them before. I know the Game Gear gets laughed at a lot, but there's actually a lot of really good games on there. And if you ever have the chance to play one of these things, you gotta play Magical Puzzle Popples. It may be one of the best puzzle games you've never played. Game Boy emulation is as equally impressive as the Game Gear. They even managed to copy the same kind of green color tone thing that you would have got off an original screen, which was pretty cool, I guess. I didn't run into any noticeable issues running any of the games on Game Boy, so it gets a pass from me. We also have the ability to play Game Boy Color games, and although many people think the Game Boy and Game Boy Color are the exact same system, but one has a color screen and the other one doesn't, they're actually a little bit different. The Game Boy Color is just a little bit beefier in its specs, and it's capable of doing some pretty cool things, which the original Game Boy wasn't capable of, and the emulation for this system is once again running pretty much spot on. I couldn't tell any differences between this and an original Game Boy Color, and the really big benefit of this console is that you get to play these games on a screen that actually lights up. Now let's talk about the Game Boy Advance, because this system enters into the start of some challenging game emulation. Now of course many of us are familiar with games that run on the Game Boy Advance that look like this, or Metroid, or even Mother 3, but there are a number of games released on the Game Boy Advance that utilize some very specific graphics abilities, like Banjo Pilot, which is a game that feels like it should have been released on the Super Nintendo. And you also have games like Duke Nukem Advance, which is a full 3D first-person shooter available on the GBA, and it's really just a fun experience, although probably not as good as the original Duke Nukem 3D. But for me, the true test of the Game Boy Advance emulator is its ability to run Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam. Unlike many other Game Boy Advance games, this one's using a full 3D engine that almost looks like something you'd see off a Nintendo DS, at least in its early days. This title can be pretty challenging for some Game Boy Advance emulators, but as far as I could tell, it ran with flying colors. Now we come to the NES, which, as you could imagine, runs pretty solid. Most people have been able to get NES games to run for years now, and this system is no different. All the games I tried on it ran great, with great audio emulation controls, and pretty much everything was exactly how you want it to be. I didn't really see anything on here that would give me any kind of indication that the emulation was running bad, so as far as I can tell, this is a pretty solid emulation. While many people tend to forget about this system, the TurboGrafx-16 has a number of really good games on the console, and as far as the emulation goes for this system, it seems to run fine. To nobody's surprise, the Sega Genesis also runs really well, running some of the more questionable games that I've seen other emulators kinda fail at, like Comix Zone. You wouldn't think Comix Zone wouldn't run on many other emulators, but I've always noticed that certain frames and animations just don't work properly. But on this console, it's fine. All the emulations of all the games I played on the Sega Genesis were fantastic. If you put these emulations directly up against the original system playing them, I wouldn't have been able to tell a difference. Now we get into more questionable emulation. Now this system has MAME built in, so you can play a whole bunch of old arcade systems, but you're probably going to struggle with playing games that are closer to the 2000s because they start to use a lot more hardware and technology that this little box just isn't capable of doing. What you will be able to play is a large collection of 90s and earlier arcade games that are really fun. Unfortunately though, because the control schemes for all these arcade systems are so wildly different, you're likely to run into some controller issues that aren't going to be that fun to work around. The moment you want to change any of the more complex settings of these emulators, you're going to have to bring out a keyboard, and the moment you have to do that, it kind of breaks away from the fun of just having a plug-and-play system. The Super Nintendo was the first system being emulated on this system that I noticed a couple of issues with. Now the majority of the games I played were fine, nothing was really out of the ordinary and everything was just going well. But the moment I started up Star Fox, I noticed that the game was running at a slightly faster emulation than it should have been running at, making the game a little bit more intense and possibly more difficult than it needed to be. The game is still playable, but for people that grew up playing Star Fox originally, you might see this and find it very awkward. Now here is by far the worst emulation this system has to offer, Nintendo 64. This is completely hit or miss, and honestly, it was mostly misses. GoldenEye's frame rate was so bad that I couldn't even get the main menu to work properly. But there were a handful of games that seemed to run okay, like Mario Kart 64 and Super Mario 64, but unfortunately you could tell that within the emulation there were certain things that were supposed to be happening, but simply weren't there, like special visual effects and stuff like that, and in some cases the frame rates dipped so low that it just really harmed the experience of playing these games overall. I wouldn't recommend playing any Nintendo 64 game off this system because at the end of the day you can find something else that can run Nintendo 64 games a lot better, like a real Nintendo 64. And finally we come to the PlayStation, the console that this whole thing was modeled after. And believe it or not, even though this isn't capable of running Nintendo 64 games, it runs PlayStation games pretty well. Load times are quick, graphics are on point, and it even has the ability to emulate the DualShock Rumble feature on an Xbox One or capable controller. It's kind of nice actually, and if you didn't know you were playing this on an original PlayStation, you might be mistaken into thinking so. In fact, this is the time you're probably going to want to bring out that PlayStation 4 controller to get as close to an authentic experience as you possibly can. This is where the system really shines because these PlayStation games work really well. I know the emulation isn't exactly 100%, but it was so close that I was really struggling to find any differences at all. If I had to criticize, I'd say that there was probably some small differences in frame rates between an original PlayStation running these games and this box right here, but it's so minute that it really doesn't bother me. The case on the system looks like an original PlayStation case, but unfortunately the power and eject buttons don't actually do anything because they're just hard plastic. But what Steven did was he wrote a customized script with a unique button on the front here that powers down the whole system using a series of scripts that he wrote. Now this is important because if you were to just unplug the system when it's on, it would actually cause a lot of bad problems with the file structure of the SD card, essentially kind of clearing it and not making it usable the next time you start it up. This power button prevents that from being an issue though, and it's kind of welcome to see. Unfortunately though, I will say this, the USB ports are on the side here, which is kind of unfortunate. I would have loved to see 2 USB ports at the front here where the controllers would have put in, and maybe an SD card slot reader where the memory card used to be. I think that would have been nice, but again, a lot of hardware design for something that is essentially still just a Raspberry Pi. Unfortunately, Steven can't sell these things because that would be very illegal. But what he has done is he's made a video online showcasing the methods he used to make the thing, plus a list of all the open source components that he utilized to actually get the whole thing to work. If you're interested in that and you have the technical know-how, go try it. Take a look at his video, see if you can make one. And hopefully one day somebody will send in a 3DO version of this, because honestly, that's the kind of stuff I like.